One of the biggest advantages of using Stencil is the ability to wrap our components so that they're compatible with any front-end framework. And today we're going to look at exactly how we can do that by building both React and Angular component libraries from our Stencil components. Now, in order to do that, we're going to be using NX, and NX is a build tool that allows us to build and maintain monorepos, so we can share and contain all of our code in one place. We're also going to be using a specific plugin for NX for Stencil that allows us to automate a lot of the steps of building framework-specific component libraries. I know it may sound like a lot, but I promise it'll make a lot more sense when we start playing around with it. So let's jump on in and get started. Okay, first things first, let's create our NX Monorepo workspace by running npx create NX workspace. We'll be prompted for a workspace name, and I'm just going to call mine NX Stencil. And in terms of what we want to create in the workspace, I'm just going to choose Core for the most basic setup. And we won't be using NX Cloud for this tutorial. Alright, so we've got our workspace set up now, and before we go any further, I want to install the NX CLI globally to run NX commands. We can do that with npm install -g NX. Next, we have to install that Stencil plugin for NX that I mentioned before. This is going to give us access to a lot of commands that will help simplify our process. So we're going to add that as a dev dependency by running npm install @nxext/stencil and then give the dev dependency flag. Great, so now we can start adding some packages to our workspace, and we'll start by adding a Stencil project using that plugin we just installed. We're going to run this command here, and the important parts here are that we're creating a library called core components, and we're adding this buildable flag. And if you get this error, you may have to install narwhal cypress first. After that, we'll have to run our Stencil library command again. Now we just have to pick a styling format. I'll choose plain CSS, and you'll see that NX generated a Stencil project in our packages directory. It's got our standard my component already created, and this is going to be the component that we create our React and Angular wrappers around. So at this point now, we're all set up to start building our framework-specific component libraries, and I'm going to create a React library first, but if you're only interested in building an Angular component library, feel free to skip ahead. I'll have that section designated in the timeline. Okay, so to build our React component library, we can actually do this with one command from our plugin. Now, what's important here is we're using the add output target command. We're specifying that we want to use our core components library, and we're indicating that the output type is React. Now, the first time you do this, you may get an error indicating that you have to install a few additional packages, and you can do that by running this command that I'll leave here. Now, running this output target command does two important things. First, it creates a core components React directory where our React components are going to live. And then it also adds the React output target to our Stencil config file in our Stencil project. You'll see it's already indicated what Stencil project we want to use, and it's determined a path for where we want to put those components. So to generate our React components now, we have to build our Stencil project with nx build core components. And you'll notice that running a build now creates a generated folder in our React components library. This folder contains all of our React components, and at this point they are ready to be used in an application. So now let's go ahead and create that React app that's going to use our components. We can do that by running nx generate @narwhal react application. I'm just going to call this app React app. I'll choose CSS for my style sheet, and I'm not going to be using any router here. Once that finishes up, I'll go on into the app.tsx file, and at the top, I'm going to import my component from our React library. Then I'm going to get rid of this boilerplate code, and instead I'm going to use our component and specify React as the first name and app as the last name. Then to see it in action, we can just run nx serve react app. Now you may see an error indicating that members must have an override modifier, and if you do, you can resolve this by setting no implicit override to false in the tsconfig file. And with that now, if we go back and open up our browser, we'll see our React component working in our React application. All right, so we've got our React workflow set up now, so let's go ahead and do the same thing for an Angular app. Let's get started by installing the narwhal Angular package as a dev dependency first. After that, we can create our Angular component library with this add output target command. We'll base this library off of our Stencil core components, and we'll specify the output type as Angular. Now when we run this, it's going to create a core components Angular directory, and it will also add the Angular output target to the Stencil config file, as we can see right here. Now with the output target defined, we can generate our Angular wrapped components by running nx build core components. From there, we're going to have to add our component to the declarations and exports in our core components Angular module. And that's actually all we have to do to set up our Angular components so they can be used in an application. So this will work just fine as it is, but the thing here is that as we start to add more components to our design system, we're also going to have to continue to maintain the imports that we have in this file. And as we get to dozens or even hundreds of components, that's going to be a little bit cumbersome. Fortunately, there's an additional config option for the Angular output target called directives array file, and I'm going to add it in our Stencil config file just like this. In doing this, we can now generate an index.ts file in our directives directory of the Angular component library. Now, this file will contain an array of all of our components of our design system. And with this addition, we're going to have to run another build on our Stencil core components. So now in our Angular module, we can just import that directives array instead of each individual component. And when we use this strategy, now we'll never need to touch this module again, even as we add more components to our design system. So now at this point, we can go ahead and create an Angular application by running the narwhal Angular application command. We'll be prompted for a name. I'm just going to call it Angular app. I'll use CSS for my styles and no router in this application. Once our app is all set up, we can go to the app.module file and import our core components Angular module from our component library. We'll also need to import the define custom elements function from our Stencil project and then call it right below. And this function is essentially going to register all of our components so that they can be used in our application. Now, the last thing we need to do in this file is add our core components Angular module to the module imports so we can make use of our components in our template. Now we can jump over to our app.component.html file and use our component right there. We can specify a first and last name, and then we're all done. At this point now, if we run nx serve Angular app, we can see our component in action. Alright, so at this point our Monorepo is pretty much all set up. We've got a central Stencil component library, and we're able to wrap those Stencil components to create React and Angular component libraries. Then we've created React and Angular applications that consume their respective components. All of our packages are working pretty seamlessly with each other. The only thing that you might notice is that the development experience here isn't great for one reason. And that's because anytime we make a change in our Stencil components, that change isn't reflected in our React or Angular apps. And if we're looking to make changes quickly, this isn't exactly the best development experience. The reason this is happening is because our React and Angular wrapped components are only changed when we build our Stencil project, and there's no build that happens when we make a change to a Stencil component. So in order for these changes to be reflected, we'll have to build our Stencil project each time we have a change, and that's certainly not ideal. However, we can streamline this process by running a build with the watch flag. So that would be nx build core components -- watch. Now we actively watch for any changes in our Stencil components, and the project rebuilds when any of those changes occur. Those changes are then propagated to our React and Angular components, and then our React and Angular apps can update based on those changes. And now we've got a much smoother development process. So when it comes to maintaining multiple packages and ensuring that they all work together well, monorepos can be a really useful way to help organize our projects. NX is an excellent tool, and it comes with a lot of support for Stencil, but it's not the only monorepo tool out there, so feel free to try out all the other options. I also encourage you to play around with a lot of the other NX plugins, like the Storybook plugin, for example, which could be really helpful if you want to document and test the components of your design system. As always, I will leave a link down in the description below to the GitHub repo with all of this code, as well as a link to the blog post that I've written detailing this entire process. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, and I will see you in the next one.